Ever find yourself like subtly changing how you act depending on like who you're with?
Totally.
You're one person with your closest friends, but a totally different version of yourself at work or around, like new people.
Yeah.
Well, today's deep dive is going to like shed light on why we do that. We're tackling social psychology, exploring how our interactions and judgments and even our identities are shaped by the groups we're part of. Think of it as getting a backstage pass to understand the invisible forces that influence us every day.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really. We're often unaware of how much our social environment shapes our thoughts and feelings, and even our sense of self.
We've got a stack of excerpts from contemporary social psychological theories to guide us. Think of this as your like cheat sheet to understanding these complex ideas. We're talking about stuff that's been puzzling thinkers for centuries. How we form those lightning-fast impressions of others, how our identities seem to shift like chameleons in different social settings, and even what gives certain groups more power than others.
It's a lot to unpack, but I think you'll find these theories surprisingly relevant to your own life.
Okay, so let's dive right in with the symbolic interaction framework. Now, this one's got some serious historical street cred. Its roots go all the way back to the 1700s.
It's a cornerstone of social psychology, for sure. The basic idea is that as humans, we're constantly interpreting symbols and meanings, and those interpretations are what drive our behavior. It's not just about the situation itself, but about the meaning we assign to it.
So it's like we're all part of this giant play,
Yeah.
and we're constantly adjusting our performances based on how we read the script and who's in the audience with us.
Exactly. Take a moment to think about how differently you might act at a formal dinner party compared to, say, a casual hangout with your best
Oh,
friends.
yeah.
It's the same you at your core, but your interpretation of the situation, the unspoken rules, and the expectations, those are the symbols that shape how you behave.
It's like putting on different hats for different occasions. And speaking of putting on different hats, the Chicago School of Sociology really took this idea of symbolic interaction and ran with it. They were like, let's see how this plays out in the real world, studying everything from everyday interactions to what's considered deviant behavior.
Their work was groundbreaking. They showed how people construct their identities in relation to others, how they navigate social norms, and even how they challenge or reinforce those norms through their actions. It's all about understanding the interplay between the individual and society.
Okay, so that's symbolic interaction. Now let's shift gears to a theory that breaks down relationships in a bit of a transactional way, social exchange theory.
Now, I know the term transactional might sound a bit cold when we're talking about human relationships, but bear with me. The basic idea here is that, consciously or not, we're all seeking benefits and minimizing costs in our interactions. This applies to friendships, romantic relationships, even professional settings.
Okay, so it's like we all have this internal balance sheet, and we're constantly weighing the pros and cons of our interactions.
Precisely. And it's not always about material things either. The benefits could be things like companionship, emotional support, validation, even just a good laugh. The costs might be things like time, energy, emotional labor, or the risk of conflict.
So if we're constantly weighing these costs and benefits, does that mean we're all just inherently selfish in our relationships?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. Think about it this way. Imagine you're at a farmer's market. You see a vendor selling delicious-looking apples. But the price seems a bit high. You start haggling, trying to negotiate a better deal. That's a classic example of negotiated social exchange. You're trying to maximize your benefits, getting the apples at a price you're comfortable with, while minimizing your costs, paying more than you want to.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about finding a balance, a win-win situation where both parties feel like they're getting something out of the interaction.
Exactly. Now, let's say you buy some of those delicious apples, and you decide to bake a pie. You share a slice with your neighbor, and they rave about how good it is. Later that week, you mentioned that you're going out of town and need someone to water your plants. Your neighbor, remembering that amazing pie, is happy to help out. That's an example of reciprocal social exchange.
I love a good pie for plant watering exchange.
hmm
So it's about that give and take over time, that sense of mutual obligation or reciprocity that can strengthen relationships.
Exactly. Now, let's say your neighbor mentions that they're moving soon and need help packing boxes. You remember how they watered your plants, so you offer to lend a hand. But here's the thing, you might not be doing it solely because they watered your plants. It's also because you've internalized this broader sense of reciprocity within your community. You help those who help you. And you trust that others will do the same for you down the line. That's generalized social exchange in action.
So it's like this web of favors and obligations that ties us together even if we don't always realize it. It's like we're all part of this giant interconnected web of social exchanges.
And finally, let's say you and some friends decide to start a community garden. You all put in the effort tilling the soil, planting seeds, weeding, watering, and you all get to share in the bounty of fresh fruits and vegetables. That's an example of productive social exchange, where the focus is on working together to achieve a common goal that benefits everyone involved.
I love that it's like the ultimate win-win, where everyone contributes and everyone benefits. It's not just about individual gain, but about creating something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely. And all of these different forms of social exchange, they're happening all around us,
Right.
all the time, shaping our relationships and influencing our social dynamic.
This is making me rethink my entire social life. But here's a question. How does social exchange tie into power dynamics? Because, let's be honest, power can get a little messy sometimes.
It can indeed. What's fascinating is that power in social networks often comes down to the structure of those networks, not just individual personalities. It's not always about being the loudest voice in the room or the most assertive person. It's often about where you're positioned within that web of relationships.
So it's not just about who you are, but about where you are in the network. That's interesting.
Think about social media influencers, for example. Their power comes from their position in a vast network, not necessarily from any inherent qualities. They've managed to place themselves at the center of a web of connections, which gives them a platform to reach and influence a large audience.
That's such a great example. It's all about reach and connection. But what about the folks who aren't in the center of those networks? What about the people on the periphery?
That's where the concepts of exclusion and inclusion become crucial to understanding power dynamics. When individuals or groups are excluded from certain networks or groups, they have less access to information, resources, and opportunities. Their voices might not be heard, and their needs might not be met. On the other hand, being included in those networks gives you access to those resources, those opportunities, and those platforms for influence.
So it's like being part of the in crowd versus being on the outside looking in. And that can have real consequences for people's lives, not just their social lives, but their opportunities and even their well-being.
Absolutely. This applies to everything from social circles to professional organizations to entire societies. Understanding these dynamics can help us create more inclusive environments where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about something we all care about, even if it can feel elusive at times. Justice and fairness.
It's a fundamental human desire to feel like we're being treated fairly. But what constitutes fairness can be surprisingly subjective and influenced by a whole bunch of factors that social psychology helps us unpack.
So it's not always as simple as right and wrong, black and white.
Not at all. One key factor is social comparison. We're constantly sizing ourselves up against others, often without even realizing it. And those comparisons can shape our perceptions of what's fair.
Oh, I do this all the time. Like, have you ever felt annoyed when a coworker seems to have a lighter workload than you, only to discover they're dealing with a ton of behind-the-scenes challenges you weren't aware of?
There you go. Our perceptions of justice are often based on incomplete information. We see the surface, but not always the full picture. And that can lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, and feelings of resentment.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible scales trying to weigh up what's fair. But those scales are constantly being calibrated by our own experiences, our social groups, and even broader cultural norms.
Precisely. And those calibrations aren't always accurate or objective. They're influenced by our own biases, our own self-interest, and our own limited perspectives.
This is heavy stuff. Okay, let's
I
shift gears a bit and get a little more personal. Let's talk about identity theory, how we define ourselves, and how those self-concepts shape our experiences.
This is where we start to explore the heart of social psychology, the core of what makes us who we are. Identity theory has roots in the work of George Herbert Mead, who argued that we don't just have one fixed, unchanging self, but rather we manage multiple identities, each with its own set of meanings and expectations.
Wait, multiple identities. So it's not about having one true self, but about adapting to different social situations.
Exactly. Think about it. You probably act differently around your boss than you do around your best friend, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you probably wouldn't use the same language or tell the same jokes around your grandmother as you would around your friends at a party. It's not about being fake, but about navigating different social spaces authentically. We all have different aspects to our personalities, different facets of who we are, and those facets might shine brighter or dimmer depending on the social context.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects back to the symbolic interaction framework we talked about earlier. It's all about interpreting the situation and adjusting our behavior accordingly. We're constantly reading the room, so to speak, and adapting our presentation of self to fit the social script.
Exactly. And it's not just about conforming to social norms. It's also about expressing different aspects of who we are. Our identities are fluid and dynamic, constantly evolving in response to our experiences and interactions.
This is making me think about all the different roles I play in my own life.
Yeah.
Friend, colleague, sibling, amateur chef, the list goes on. And I guess each of those roles comes with its own set of expectations, behaviors, and even emotions.
That's a great way to put it. And here's where it gets really interesting for us. Our emotions aren't just personal reactions, they're deeply intertwined with our identities. When our identities are affirmed, when we feel seen and understood for who we truly are, we experience positive emotions like joy, pride, and a sense of belonging. But when our identities are threatened, when we feel misunderstood, judged, or rejected, we experience negative emotions like shame, sadness, or anger.
So it's not just about how we see ourselves, but about how others see us, how those perceptions either validate or invalidate our sense of self.
Precisely, and those perceptions can have a powerful impact on our emotions and even our behavior. Think about a time when you felt awkward or out of place in a social situation, like you weren't quite sure how to act or what role to play. That feeling of awkwardness, that's often tied to what's called identity non-verification, when others don't see us the way we want to be seen, or when we feel like we're not living up to the expectations associated with a particular identity.
Wow, that hits close to home. We've all been there. It's like that feeling of being a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. And I guess when those feelings of identity non-verification persist, they can really take a toll on our self-esteem and our overall well-being.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who see us, appreciate us, and affirm our identities.
Hmm.
People who make us feel like we can be our authentic selves without judgment or pretense.
Okay, let's move on to another theory that I think is particularly relevant in today's world, social identity theory. This one delves into how we categorize ourselves into groups and how those group affiliations impact our perceptions of us versus them.
This theory is crucial for understanding intergroup relations, both the positive and negative aspects. It's about recognizing that we don't just have individual identities, but also social identities, based on the groups we belong to.
So it's like we all belong to different tribes, our families, our communities, our fan clubs, even our online communities, yeah. And those tribal affiliations shape how we see the world and interact with others.
You got it. Think about being a fan of a sports team. The joy of victory is amplified because it's a shared identity, a collective triumph. And on the flip side, rivalries with other teams can feel so intense because those group identities are pitted against each other.
That makes sense. Our brains are wired for connection and belonging, and those group affiliations can provide a powerful sense of identity and purpose. But it can also lead to us versus them thinking, which isn't always a good thing.
Exactly. Social identity theory helps us understand how those dynamics work, both the positive aspects of group solidarity and the potential downsides of prejudice and discrimination.
Okay, so we talked about how we form identities, both individual and social. But now let's explore why some groups seem to matter more than others. Why are some groups seen as more prestigious, more influential, or just more important?
That's where status construction theory comes in. It explores how social hierarchies are built and maintained, often in subtle and unconscious ways.
Okay, so tell us more about this. How are these hierarchies constructed? It feels like there's more to it than just differences in power or resources.
You're right, it's often more about perception than reality. This theory highlights how status beliefs, Lise, those assumptions we hold about different groups, play a powerful role in shaping social hierarchies. And here's the kicker. These beliefs aren't always based on objective facts or evidence.
So it's not just about actual differences in, say, wealth or education,
Yeah.
but about our beliefs, about those differences, beliefs that might not even be accurate.
Exactly. And those beliefs become self-fulfilling prophecies. For instance, if we believe that people from a certain group are naturally more intelligent or competent, we might unconsciously give them more opportunities to succeed, or treat their ideas with more weight. And those successes then reinforce our initial beliefs, creating a cycle that can be difficult to break.
That's wild. It's like we're all playing this game with a set of rules that we didn't even create. Rules that are based on these invisible, often inaccurate status beliefs. But where do these beliefs come from?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They're often rooted in historical power dynamics, cultural stereotypes, and even just our own limited experiences. The good news is that because these beliefs are socially constructed, they can also be challenged and deconstructed. But it takes conscious effort and a willingness to question our assumptions.
Okay, so if these status hierarchies are built on beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
how do those beliefs become so ingrained? How do they become accepted as truth and translate into actual power structures that people obey?
That, my friend, is where legitimacy theory comes in. It's amazing to think that all of this is happening beneath the surface of our everyday interactions, isn't it? It's like there's this whole hidden world of social dynamics that we're constantly navigating, often without even realizing it.
Right, it really makes you appreciate the complexity of human behavior, right? But we haven't even touched on social networks yet. I mean, it's not just about how individuals interact, but how we're all connected in these complex webs of relationships.
You're right, social networks are a whole other layer of complexity. And luckily, we have some theories that can help us untangle these webs. One of them is called, straightforwardly enough, the social network's structural focus theory. It might sound like a mouthful, but the idea is actually quite simple.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's the gist of this theory?
The core concept is that the ties that bind us, those connections we form with others, aren't random. They're organized around shared foci. Now, these foci can be anything: shared interests, activities, goals, even physical locations.
So it's like we're drawn to people who occupy similar spaces in the world, whether those spaces are physical or metaphorical.
Precisely. Think about your own social network. You
Yeah.
probably have different groups of friends based on different aspects of your life. Colleagues from work, friends from your book club, friends you hike with, maybe even online gaming buddies. Each of these groups represents a different focus, a different point of connection.
That makes a lot of sense. I've definitely got my foodie friends and my podcast pals.
Hmm.
And I guess the more interests and activities we have, the more complex and interconnected our networks become.
Exactly. And the size and density of these networks can actually have a significant impact on our experiences and opportunities. For example, the larger a group or network is, the more likely its members are to encounter people who also have large networks.
So it's like that saying, it's all about who you know.
Mm.
Popular people tend to know other popular people, and those connections create a kind of ripple effect.
That's the general idea. Think of it like a bustling city. Some people live on the outskirts, while others are right in the heart of downtown, constantly bumping into new people and encountering new opportunities. Those highly connected individuals become hubs of information and influence.
That makes sense. They're like the social butterflies,
Yeah.
sliding from one group to another, spreading information and connecting people.
And that flow of information is key. Information tends to travel faster and more widely in networks with lots of these highly connected individuals. They act as amplifiers, spreading ideas, trends, and even social movements.
So those super connectors are like the influencers of the offline world. They might not have millions of followers online,
Mhm.
but they have that same ability to shape opinions and mobilize action within their networks.
Exactly. They're the ones who always seem to know what's going on, who to talk to, and how to get things done. They're the lifeblood of social networks.
This is fascinating. It really highlights how interconnected we all are, even if we don't always realize it. But speaking of connections, let's talk about a concept that I've always found intriguing. Homophily. It sounds a bit technical, but I think the idea is actually quite relatable.
It is. Homophily refers to the tendency for people to associate with others who are similar to themselves. We're naturally drawn to people who share our values, beliefs, interests, even our demographics. It's that old adage, birds of a feather flock together.
It's so true. I mean, I love hanging out with people who share my love for obscure documentaries and spicy food. But I guess homophily isn't always a good thing, right?
You're right to be cautious. While homophily can create a sense of comfort and belonging, it can also lead to echo chambers where our existing beliefs are constantly reinforced without being challenged. This can stifle critical thinking and make it harder to understand different perspectives.
So it's like being stuck in a bubble where everyone agrees with you all the time. That doesn't sound very stimulating or conducive to growth.
Exactly. Diversity of thought and experience is so important for personal and societal progress. Homophily, when it leads to extreme insularity, can be a barrier to that progress. It can reinforce existing prejudices, limit opportunities for marginalized groups, and even fuel political polarization.
That's a sobering thought. It's a reminder that we need to actively seek out diverse perspectives and challenge our own biases if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't agree more. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's delve into the fascinating interplay between our emotions and our social interactions. We've talked about how our emotions are tied to our identities, but there's a whole theory dedicated to exploring the role of emotions in social exchange, the effect theory of social exchange.
Okay, this sounds right up my alley. I'm all about exploring the emotional landscape of human interaction. So tell us more about this theory. What's the key takeaway?
The core idea is that our emotions aren't just personal reactions to events. They're deeply influenced by the nature of our social exchanges. The tasks we undertake, the relationships we're in, the structures of our interactions, all of these factors can trigger specific emotions.
So it's not just about whether an interaction is positive or negative, but about the specific type of interaction and the emotions that are likely to arise from it.
Exactly. For example, working together on a challenging but rewarding task with a group of people can elicit feelings of camaraderie, excitement, and even joy in the face of setbacks. On the other hand, navigating a tense negotiation where the stakes are high might trigger anxiety, frustration, or even anger.
So our emotions are like a barometer for the quality and nature of our social exchanges.
That's a great way to put it. And those emotions can then feed back into our interactions, influencing how we perceive others, how we behave, and even the decisions we make. Positive emotions tend to strengthen our bonds with others, while negative emotions can create distance and conflict.
It's like a feedback loop. If I'm constantly having frustrating or stressful interactions with someone, those negative feelings are going to color my perceptions of them, which might lead to more conflict down the line.
Precisely. And conversely, positive interactions can create a virtuous cycle, fostering trust, goodwill, and a sense of shared purpose.
This makes me think about different types of relationships. Like, romantic relationships are often characterized by intense emotions, both positive and negative. Is there anything in this theory that explains that?
Absolutely. One of the key insights from this theory is that the more interdependent we are with someone, the more we rely on each other for support, validation, and a sense of belonging, the more intense our emotions are likely to be, both the good and the bad.
So, because romantic partners are usually highly interdependent, their emotions are amplified. Their highs are higher, their lows are lower.
Exactly. They're more invested in the relationship, so the stakes are higher, both emotionally and practically.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the same logic would apply to other close relationships,
Mm,
like those with family members or close friends.
precisely. The more we depend on someone, the more emotionally invested we become in the relationship, and that can make us both more vulnerable and more capable of experiencing profound joy and connection.
This theory really sheds light on the emotional roller coaster of human relationships. It's like our feelings are a barometer for the quality of our social connections. But speaking of feelings, how do we even make sense of those emotions in the context of our social interactions? How do we know whether we're being treated fairly, whether our needs are being met, or whether we're getting our fair share in a relationship?
That's where comparison theory comes in. It focuses on how we evaluate our own situations and experiences by comparing them to others. It's a fundamental part of how we make judgments about fairness, justice, even our own self-worth.
Okay, this feels particularly relevant these days, especially with social media. It's like we're constantly bombarded with images and stories of other people's seemingly perfect lives, which can make it hard not to compare ourselves and feel like we're falling short.
You've hit the nail on the head. Social media has amplified our opportunities for comparison, but the underlying principle is nothing new. We're social creatures, and we're constantly looking to others as a reference point for evaluating our own experiences.
So whether we're comparing our salaries to our colleagues, our homes to our neighbors, or our vacation photos to our friends' Instagram posts, we're constantly sizing ourselves up against others.
Precisely. And those comparisons can be conscious or unconscious, explicit or implicit. Sometimes we might make direct comparisons like, he got promoted before me and we started at the same time. Oh, wow. And she seems to have it all, the career, the family, the perfect Instagram feed. But other times, those comparisons are more subtle and insidious, shaping our perceptions without us even realizing it.
And I'm guessing those comparisons can impact how we feel about ourselves and our own lives.
Absolutely. If we perceive ourselves as coming up short in those comparisons, if we feel like we're not as successful, as attractive, as happy as whatever metric we're using there, it can lead to feelings of inadequacy, envy, and even resentment.
So comparison can be a real buzzkill.
It can be, for sure. But it's important to remember that comparison is a natural human tendency. It's how we make sense of the world, how we figure out where we stand, and how we set goals for ourselves. The key is to be mindful of our comparisons, to recognize that they don't always reflect the full picture, and to avoid letting those comparisons dictate our self-worth.
So it's not about avoiding comparison altogether, but about being more aware of how those comparisons are influencing our thoughts, feelings, and even our behavior.
Exactly. It's about questioning those comparisons, challenging the metrics we're using, and focusing on our own unique journeys rather than constantly compare ourselves to others.
That's really good advice. It's about recognizing that we're all running our own races. And there's no point in comparing our chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. But this whole discussion of comparison makes me think about how it plays into our understanding of status hierarchies. We've talked about how status can be constructed, but how does comparison factor into the equation?
That's a great question. And it brings us to another fascinating theory, expectation states theory. This theory explores how status differences can emerge and influence our interactions, even in groups that seem relatively equal on the surface.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell us more about this theory. How do these expectation states work?
The basic idea is that we all carry around a set of expectations about how people are likely to behave based on their social characteristics. These characteristics could be anything from age and gender to occupation and education level.
So it's like we have these mental shortcuts, these pre-programmed assumptions about who's likely to be competent, who's likely to be in charge, or who has the most valuable contributions to make.
Exactly. These are our expectation states, and they're often based on societal norms, stereotypes, and even our own past experiences. Now, here's the kicker. These expectations can shape our behavior in subtle but significant ways. We might unconsciously defer to someone we perceive as having higher status, even if we're not consciously aware of doing so. We might give their ideas more weight, seek their approval more often, or even just give them more physical space in a room.
So it's like status isn't just about formal titles or positions of authority, but about these underlying beliefs and expectations that we carry around. Beliefs that can influence how we interact with others, even in informal settings.
Precisely. And those beliefs can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we expect someone to be a leader, we might unconsciously treat them in ways that make it more likely for them to emerge as a leader. We might give them more opportunities to speak, seek their opinions more often, and attribute their successes to their inherent abilities, while attributing their failures to external factors.
This is making me think about those people who just seem to command attention when they walk into a room. It's like they're radiating status, even if they're not saying a word.
Exactly. And it's not always about individual charisma or personality. It's often about those deeply ingrained expectations that are triggered by their social characteristics. We see someone who fits a certain mold. Maybe they're older, maybe they're dressed in a certain way, maybe they speak with a certain air of confidence, and we unconsciously assign them a higher status based on those cues.
This theory is really making me rethink all those times I've found myself deferring to someone else's opinion or assuming someone else would be better suited for a leadership role. It's like, how much of that was based on my own internalized expectations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not always easy to disentangle our conscious thoughts from our unconscious biases, but the first step is awareness. Once we start to recognize how these expectations operate, we can start to challenge them and create more equitable dynamics in our interactions.
This whole discussion of expectations and status construction makes me wonder, how do these hierarchies become so ingrained? How do they go from being unspoken assumptions to being accepted as truth?
That's where status construction theory, which we touched on earlier, comes back into play. This theory goes beyond individual expectations and looks at how these status hierarchies are built and maintained on a societal level, often in ways that are so subtle and pervasive that we barely even notice them.
Okay, so remind us how this theory works again. How are these hierarchies constructed?
Status construction theory focuses on how status beliefs on site, those widely held assumptions about different groups, play a powerful role in shaping social hierarchies. And here's the kicker. These beliefs aren't always based on objective facts or evidence.
So it's not just about actual differences in, say, wealth or education, but about our beliefs, about those differences, beliefs that might not even be accurate.
Precisely. And those beliefs can become self-fulfilling prophecies. For instance, if we believe that people from a certain group are naturally more intelligent or competent, we might unconsciously give them more opportunities to succeed or treat their ideas with more weight. And those successes then reinforce our initial beliefs, creating a cycle that can be difficult to break.
That's wild. It's like we're all playing this game with a set of rules that we didn't even create, rules that are based on these invisible, often inaccurate status beliefs. But where did these beliefs come from?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They're often rooted in historical power dynamics, cultural stereotypes, and even just our own limited experiences. The good news is that because these beliefs are socially constructed, they can also be challenged and deconstructed. But it takes conscious effort and a willingness to question our assumptions.
Okay, so if these status hierarchies are built on beliefs, how do those beliefs become so ingrained? How do they become accepted as truth and translate into actual power structures that people obey?
That, my friend, is where legitimacy theory comes in.
Oh, legitimacy. We talked about this a bit earlier, right? It's about how power becomes justified in the eyes of the people, even if that justification isn't always based on logic or fairness.
Exactly. It's the glue that holds social hierarchies together. Without legitimacy, power is fragile and unstable. People are more likely to resist or rebel against leaders and institutions they don't perceive as legitimate. Legitimacy theory identifies different sources of legitimacy, each with its own way of making power seem justified.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Remind us about these different sources of legitimacy.
One source is tradition. This relies on the idea that this is how it's always been done. We see this in monarchies, religious institutions, and even some cultural practices that have been passed down through generations. The weight of history and precedent can make power seem legitimate, even if it's not necessarily fair or just.
So it's like the longer something has been around, the more legitimate it seems, even if it's outdated or doesn't serve everyone equally. It's like that old saying, that's just the way we've always done it.
Precisely. Another source of legitimacy is charisma. This is all about the personal appeal of a leader. Think of revolutionary figures who inspire followers through their personality, their vision, their ability to connect with people on an emotional level. Charismatic leaders can make power seem legitimate, even if they lack formal authority or don't follow traditional rules.
So charisma can be a powerful force for change, but it can also be used to manipulate and exploit.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. A third source of legitimacy is legality. This is based on rules and procedures. The idea that power is legitimate because it follows a set of agreed-upon laws. We see this in democratic systems where leaders are elected through a fair and transparent process, and where laws are created and enforced in a way that's perceived as just and impartial.
So legality is about creating a system of rules that everyone plays by, and that makes power seem more fair and accountable.
Precisely. But it's important to note that legality is not always a guarantee of legitimacy. If the laws themselves are unjust or the system is corrupt, then legality can become a tool for oppression rather than a source of true legitimacy.
That's a really important point. It's like, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's ethical or just. We still have a responsibility to question those laws and challenge those in power when they're not acting in the best interest of the people.
Exactly. Critical thinking is crucial. We can't just blindly accept things as they are because they've always been that way or because someone in a position of authority tells us to.
This whole discussion of legitimacy is really making me think about how social structures can be both incredibly powerful and incredibly fragile at the same time. They rely on this delicate balance of beliefs, expectations, and perceived justification.
That's a great insight. Social structures are not set in stone. They're dynamic processes that are shaped by our collective actions and beliefs. And legitimacy is a key part of that ongoing negotiation. But we're not just passive bystanders in this process. We all have a role to play in shaping the social structures that shape our lives.
This has been an incredible journey so far. We've talked about how our social networks influence our experiences, how our emotions are entangled with our interactions, how we navigate comparisons, and how power dynamics play out in subtle and not so subtle ways. But we're not done yet. There's still so much more to uncover as we delve deeper into the fascinating world of social psychology. Okay, so we've journeyed through like this fascinating maze of social psychology, uncovering hidden forces that shape how we connect, judge, and understand ourselves within groups. From those first impressions based on symbolic interactions to the complexities of social exchange and the weight of legitimacy, it's like peeking behind the curtain of everyday life, right?
Yeah, it really underscores that we're not just individuals like moving through the world in isolation, but interconnected beings constantly influencing and being influenced by our social environments.
One thing that's really stuck with me is how much happens beneath the surface, right? All these unconscious biases, those hidden scripts, those unspoken expectations. It's humbling to realize how much we're not even aware of.
Right. It is. But the beauty of social psychology is that it brings those hidden forces to light. And that awareness can be incredibly empowering.
Totally. It's like once you see those patterns, those ingrained beliefs about status, or those knee-jerk comparisons we make. You can start making more conscious choices about how you show up in the world.
Precisely.
You're not just going through life on autopilot anymore.
Social psychology isn't just about understanding why people do the things they do. It's about using that knowledge to create positive change, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
So it's not just theoretical. It has real-world applications.
Absolutely. It can inform everything from interventions to reduce prejudice and discrimination to strategies for building more cohesive and collaborative teams. It can even help us design more effective policies that promote social justice and well-being.
That's what makes this so fascinating. It's like by understanding these social dynamics, we can actually start to shift them in a more positive direction, right?
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive bystanders in this social dance, we're active participants. We have the power to challenge those outdated norms, to disrupt those harmful stereotypes, and to create more inclusive and equitable environments.
So if our listener could take away just one key insight from this deep dive into social psychology, what would it be?
That's a tough one. But if I had to choose, I'd say this. Our social world is not a fixed reality. It's a dynamic construction. And we're all active participants in creating and shaping that reality.
And we're not just pawns in a game. We're the players.
Exactly. And we have the power to change the rules of the game, to challenge those structures that no longer serve us, and to create a more just and equitable world for ourselves and for future generations.
That's a powerful message to end on. So to our listener, we encourage you to stay curious, keep questioning, and keep exploring this fascinating world of social psychology. It's not just about memorizing theories, it's about using those theories as lenses through which to view your own experiences and to make sense of the world around you.
And remember, social psychology is an ongoing exploration, not a set of fixed answers. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to question.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into social psychology. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Until next time, stay curious.